I was standing in my own kitchen unwrapping a stack of wedding china when a stranger's voice on the phone told me something no wife should ever have to hear about her husband. "I saw them together," he said. "Your husband and his mother. Don't tell him. Come alone." I stood there with a teacup in my hand, staring at the two people I trusted most in the world, laughing softly in my living room, and I understood in that instant that the life I thought I was building might already be gone. My name is Catherine Baker, and 7 days earlier my husband Jonathan and I had closed on the house of our dreams, a 2-story colonial with a wraparound porch and a garden bed I'd already mapped out in my head for tomatoes and hydrangeas. I had put down most of the money myself, an inheritance from my father, a man who spent 30 years teaching high school chemistry and never once complained about the modest life it gave him. He left me enough to make this house possible. And when I signed the closing papers, I remember thinking that he would have been proud. I remember thinking that finally, at 40 years old, I had built something permanent. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while boxes still lined the hallway and the smell of fresh paint hung in the air. I didn't recognize the number, so I almost let it go to voicemail. Something made me answer. "Mrs. Baker, this is Thomas Reed. I sold you the house." I remembered him instantly, a soft-spoken man in his 70s, a retired electrical engineer with kind eyes and a slight tremor in his hands when he shook mine at the closing table. He'd lived in that house for 31 years with his late wife, and when he handed over the keys, he'd told me he hoped it would treat me as well as it had treated them. "Mr. Reed, is everything all right?" There was a pause long enough that I thought the call had dropped. "I need to apologize for something," he finally said. "When we set up the smart home system years ago, we installed a security camera in the living room. I disconnected most of them before the sale, but I missed one. It's still linked to my cloud account. I only noticed because I got a notification a few days ago and I went to delete the footage and He stopped again. "Mrs. Baker, I think you need to see this yourself." My stomach tightened, though I couldn't have told you why. "See what?" "I'd rather not say over the phone. I saved everything to a drive. Please come see me. Alone. Don't say anything to your husband yet." His voice dropped lower, careful, almost protective. "Please, come alone." I told him I would, and I hung up before I could ask anything else because my hands had started to shake and I didn't want him to hear it in my voice. I set the phone down on the counter and looked through the doorway into the living room where Jonathan was standing on a step stool, hanging a framed photograph of his parents' wedding day. And his mother Diane was directing him with the calm authority of a woman who had never once doubted her own judgment. "A little to the left," she said, and Jonathan adjusted it without complaint, the way he always did with her. They were laughing about something, some small joke I hadn't caught, and for a moment I just watched them searching their faces for some crack, some sign of whatever Thomas Reed thought I needed to see. There was nothing. Jonathan turned and caught my eye and smiled at me, that same easy smile that had made me fall for him 12 years ago, back when I was still grieving my father, and he showed up at exactly the right moments with exactly the right words. "You okay?" he asked. "You look pale." "Fine," I said. "Just tired. I think I'm going to run out for a bit. I forgot we're low on paint for the guest room." It was a lie, smooth and immediate, and it frightened me a little how easily it came. Diane glanced at me, her eyes lingering half a second too long the way they sometimes did, as if she were always quietly measuring me against some standard I would never meet. "Take your time, dear," she said. "We'll finish up here." I grabbed my keys and my purse and walked out to the car with my heart hammering against my ribs, and I sat behind the wheel for a full minute before I could make myself turn the key. I told myself it was nothing, a misunderstanding. Maybe Thomas Reed had simply seen Jonathan and Diane moving furniture or measuring for curtains or doing any of the 100 mundane things people do when they're settling into a new home. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation, because that was easier than the alternative. But some part of me already knew. Some part of me had known for a while in the way, you know a storm is coming before the sky actually turns the small hesitations. Before Jonathan answered certain questions the way Diane had insisted on being there for the final walk through, the way both of them had grown a little too comfortable, a little too fast in a house that had my father's money holding up its foundation. I pulled out of the driveway and looked once in the rearview mirror at the house, my house, I reminded myself, glowing gold in the late afternoon light, looking exactly like the future I had planned for myself. I didn't know yet that I was driving toward the moment that would end my marriage. I only knew that whatever waited for me at Thomas Reed's front door, I needed to see it with my own eyes. Thomas Reed's new place was a small rental on the other side of town, the kind of tidy, quiet house that belongs to a man who has spent his whole life being careful. He opened the door before I even knocked, as though he'd been watching for my car, and the look on his face told me this wasn't going to be the misunderstanding I'd hoped for on the drive over. "Thank you for coming," he said, stepping aside to let me in. "I wasn't sure you would." "You made it sound important." "It is." He led me to a small kitchen table where a laptop was already open, the screen dark, waiting. "Please sit." I sat, and I noticed my hands were cold despite the warm afternoon, and I folded them together in my lap because I didn't want him to see them trembling. Thomas lowered himself into the chair across from me with the careful movements of a man whose knees had given him trouble for years, and he was quiet for a moment before he spoke again. "I want you to understand something first," he said. "I'm not a man who goes looking for other people's business. I built that camera system myself years ago, mostly for my wife's peace of mind when I traveled for work. When we sold the house, I disconnected every camera I could remember. I missed one, the one behind the bookshelf in the living room, wired into an outlet I forgot even existed. I only found out it was still active because my cloud storage sent a notification that it was full." He paused. "I went to delete the footage, and then I watched it, and I couldn't in good conscience delete it without showing you first." "Show me," I said, because I couldn't bear the waiting anymore. He turned the laptop toward me and pressed play. The footage was time-stamped from 4 days earlier, a Friday afternoon when I'd been at the office finishing a project that had kept me late into the evening. The angle was slightly elevated, looking down over the living room, my living room still half-furnished boxes stacked along one wall. I watched Jonathan let himself in through the front door, and a moment later, Diane followed him inside, glancing around the room the way a person looks at something they're already picturing as their own. I watched myself lean forward without meaning to, as though getting closer to the screen might somehow change what I was about to hear. "She still thinks this house belongs to both of you," Diane said on the recording, settling onto the arm of the sofa, her voice carrying that particular blend of warmth and steel I'd heard my entire marriage. Sweet girl. She never even reads the fine print. Jonathan laughed an easy, familiar laugh, the same one I'd fallen in love with 12 years ago, and said, "She trusts me. Why would she read the fine print? I'm her husband." "That trust is useful," Diane said, "as long as we use it correctly." I felt something cold settle into my chest, a stillness that didn't yet have a name. They kept talking. Diane mentioned a refinance package. She'd already been in contact with a broker about someone she knew personally, someone who wouldn't ask too many questions. Jonathan mentioned that my father's inheritance had covered nearly 70% of the down payment, and Diane responded that it was a shame money like that hadn't gone through proper family channels, that it should have been structured better from the start. They spoke about paperwork, about a power of attorney clause buried somewhere in a stack of documents that would let ownership shift gradually, quietly, legally, without ever requiring a single dramatic confrontation. Diane said the words, "over time," more than once, savoring them the way you might describe a recipe that needed patience to come together properly. "She won't notice," Jonathan said. "She never notices these things. She trusts me with all of it." I sat frozen at Thomas Reed's kitchen table, watching my husband describe my blind trust as a resource to be managed, and I understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the man who had held my hand at my father's funeral and the man on that screen were somehow impossibly the same person. The video ran another 6 minutes. I watched all of it. I watched Diane walk through my kitchen, opening cabinets, commenting that the layout would be better suited to proper entertaining once a few walls came down. I watched Jonathan nod along to every suggestion, agreeable in the particular way he'd always been agreeable with his mother, a lifelong habit I had once found endearing because it spoke, I thought, of loyalty and love. I understood now that it spoke of something else. Obedience, maybe, or alliance. When the footage ended, Thomas closed the laptop gently, as though closing it too fast might hurt me further. I copied everything onto a drive. he said, sliding a small USB stick across the table toward me. Every angle, every date, everything the camera caught. I don't know what's going on in your marriage, Mrs. Baker, and it isn't my place to guess. But a house holds people accountable to nothing except what's documented. I thought you should have this before anyone decides to erase what actually happened inside those walls. I picked up the drive and held it in my palm, small and light, barely the weight of a house key, and yet it felt like it might tip the entire foundation of my life. Thank you, I said, and my voice came out steadier than I expected. I don't know how to repay this. You don't owe me anything, he said. I sold that house because my wife and I made a home in it, and I'd hate to think of someone taking that same chance away from another family through a lie. He walked me to the door, and just before I stepped out into the fading light, he said one more thing quietly, almost like a warning. You still have time, Mrs. Baker. Whatever you decide to do, you still have time to do it right. I drove home with the USB drive tucked into my coat pocket, my hand resting over it at every red light, as though it might disappear if I let go. And somewhere on that quiet drive back to the house I had paid for with my father's memory, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront them. Not yet. Not until I understood exactly how deep this went, and exactly how to make sure it could never happen to me or to anyone else again. I walked back into my own house that evening and became someone else. Not a different woman exactly, just a quieter version of myself, one who had learned in the space of a single afternoon that the safest place to keep the truth was behind a closed door in my own chest. How was the paint store? Jonathan asked, not even looking up from the box of kitchen utensils he was unpacking. Busy, I said. I'll go back tomorrow when it's quieter. He nodded satisfied, and that was the end of it. I remember standing in the doorway for a moment watching him arrange our forks and knives into the drawer organizer I'd bought weeks earlier with such simple happiness and feeling something strange settle over me. Not rage, not yet, but a kind of cold clarity like stepping outside on the first frost of the year and finally being able to see your own breath. Over the following days I did something I had never done in 12 years of marriage. I started watching my husband the way you watch a stranger. I noticed things I'd always seen but never truly looked at. Jonathan handled every piece of financial paperwork that came through our mailbox, sorting bills and statements with a practiced efficiency I'd once admired, calling it just easier this way, whenever I offered to help. I noticed that Diane, who visited nearly every other day under the guise of helping us settle in, always managed to be the one who collected the mail from the box at the end of the driveway before I even got home from work. I noticed the way their conversation would shift the moment I entered a room, not stopping exactly but softening, rerouting, like water finding a different path around a rock. None of it on its own would have meant anything. Together, it meant everything. 3 days after my visit to Thomas Reed's house, Jonathan came home with a folder of documents and laid them on the dining table with the easy, unbothered manner of a man discussing weekend plans. Refinance paperwork, he said. Nothing exciting, just cleaning up some of the loan terms now that we've closed. Routine stuff. Diane, who happened to be there, she seemed always to happen to be there, reached over and patted my hand. Everyone does this after closing, dear. It's boring, but it's just paperwork. You sign a few pages and it's done. I looked at the folder, thick and official, and felt the cold clarity from days earlier harden into something more useful. A plan. Of course, I said, smiling. Let me look it over when I have a quiet evening. I like to actually read things before I sign You Know How I Am. Jonathan's jaw tightened for half a second, so briefly I might have imagined it if I hadn't been watching so closely. Of course, he said. No rush. But there was a rush. I could feel it in the air between them, in the way Diane's eyes flicked toward Jonathan and back to me in the slight practiced patience of two people trying not to seem eager. I asked innocent questions over the following evenings. What does this clause mean? Why is this section highlighted? Is this the standard form the bank uses? And each time Jonathan answered smoothly, confidently, clearly relieved that I wasn't pushing harder. He began to relax. He began, I think, to believe that his mother had been right about me all along, that I was too trusting, too soft, too in love to ever really look. What he didn't know was that every night after he fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and a soft blue light going through every page of that folder line by line. I photographed each document with my phone before returning the folder exactly to where he'd left it. I opened a new email account under a name that meant nothing to anyone but me, and began forwarding copies there along with photos, screenshots, and dates. I kept a small voice recorder in my cardigan pocket during family dinners, capturing conversations I would later replay in my car during my lunch break, parked 3 blocks from my office, where no one I knew would see me crying quietly before wiping my face and going back to work like nothing had happened. I built a folder of my own, a shadow archive invisible to them growing heavier every day with proof of exactly what I'd witnessed on Thomas Reed's laptop. It was on the 5th night, reading by the small glow of my screen while Jonathan slept upstairs, that I found the clause that changed everything. Buried on page 14 of the refinance documents in language so dense and technical it seemed designed to be skipped over was a provision granting Jonathan limited power of attorney over matters related to the property, to be enacted upon my signature and notarized approval. It was worded carefully, almost elegantly, framed as a convenient something to streamline future paperwork so I wouldn't be burdened by routine administrative matters. I read it 3 times to be certain I understood what I was looking at. It wasn't a refinance, or rather it was a refinance wrapped around something else entirely. A legal key that once turned would let Jonathan make decisions about my house, my father's money, my future without ever needing to ask me again. I sat very still in the dark kitchen listening to the old house settle around me, its unfamiliar creaks still strange to my ears after only a week of living there. I thought about my father, about the quiet, careful way he'd saved his money over 30 years of teaching chemistry to teenagers who mostly didn't care about how he used to tell me that the surest way to lose something valuable wasn't theft. It was trust handed to the wrong person without ever checking where it landed. I closed the laptop, and for the first time since that phone call, I allowed myself a small, grim smile in the darkness. They thought I was signing away my future. I was about to make sure I never lost it at all. I found Michael Grant's name the way most people find lawyers when they're afraid to ask anyone they know, a late-night search on my phone in bed with the screen brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't wake Jonathan beside me. Real estate attorney. 26 years of practice. Reviews that used words like discreet and thorough. I called his office the next morning from the parking lot of the grocery store, my heart pounding as though I were doing something shameful instead of something necessary, and I asked for the earliest appointment available that didn't require me to explain myself to a receptionist. Michael Grant's office was small and unglamorous, tucked above a dry cleaner's on a quiet street, and I liked him immediately for exactly that reason. Nothing about him seemed interested in impressing me. He was maybe 58 gray at the temples, with the unhurried manner of a man who had seen every version of the story I was about to tell him, and had stopped being surprised by any of them years ago. I brought everything: the USB drive, my photographs of the documents, copies of emails, the voice recordings which I'd organized by date on my phone. I set it all on his desk like evidence at a trial because, in some sense, I suppose that's exactly what it was. He watched the footage first in silence, his expression unreadable, occasionally pausing to write something on a legal pad in handwriting too small for me to read upside down. When it ended, he sat back in his chair and looked at me for a long moment before he spoke. "Mrs. Baker, I want to be direct with you because I think you'd prefer that to gentleness right now." "Please," I said. "This is not a routine refinance. The power of attorney clause on page 14, if signed and notarized, would give your husband broad authority over decisions related to the property. Not immediately total control, but enough scaffolding that over time, with a few more carefully worded documents, he could transfer ownership, take out loans against the equity, or sell the property, all without requiring your active participation in each step. It's built to look harmless. It's built to be signed by someone who trusts the person handing it to them and doesn't read past the first paragraph." I felt my hands tighten in my lap. So it's legal. On its face, yes. That's what makes it dangerous. There's nothing illegal about a spouse asking another spouse to sign paperwork. The law generally assumes that if you signed something, you understood it, which means the only real protection you have is not signing it, and making very sure they can't quietly force the issue another way. Can they? Not if we move quickly. He tapped his pen against the pad. I can file protective measures today. a notice of interest, updated deed language, and a formal record establishing you as the sole party with authority to approve any transfer or encumbrance on the property. It won't stop them from asking you to sign anything. But it will mean that even if you did sign under pressure or without fully understanding, any transfer would require your personal, verified appearance and separate legal counsel review before it could be finalized. In plain terms, I'm building a wall around the house that only you can open. Relief moved through me so suddenly it was almost dizzying, but underneath it sat something harder, something that had been growing since the night I first read that clause by the glow of my laptop. I want more than a wall, Mr. Grant. I want them to understand exactly what they tried to do. I want it documented. I want it undeniable. He studied me for a moment, and something shifted in his expression, not surprise exactly, but a kind of quiet respect. Then we do this carefully. You continue exactly as you have been. Don't refuse to sign. Don't confront them. Let them believe they're close to finishing what they started. The more comfortable they become, the more they'll say, and the more they say, the stronger your position becomes. In the meantime, I file everything necessary to make sure that no matter what happens at that table, nothing actually transfers without going through me first. I left his office that afternoon with a folder of my own, now carbon copies of every filing he'd promised to submit that week, and I drove home rehearsing quietly the version of myself I needed to keep performing. Grateful wife, trusting wife. A woman slowly, sweetly coming around to signing away a life she didn't yet know was already legally armored against them. It worked better than I expected. Within 2 days, Jonathan's demeanor had shifted from cautious to comfortable, the tightness I'd noticed around his jaw during our first conversation about the paperwork now entirely gone. He began speaking more openly at dinner, mentioning offhand that maybe once things were settled, he'd finally get quotes for that home office he'd always wanted in the basement. Diane, sensing victory the way she seemed to sense everything, began arriving with paint swatches and furniture catalogs, holding them up against my walls, with the proprietary confidence of a woman decorating a house she already considered hers. I watched them build their comfort like a house of cards, one relaxed conversation at a time, and I said nothing to disturb it. On a Thursday evening, Diane mentioned almost casually that she knew a notary who could come by the house directly, so much easier than driving somewhere dear, especially with how busy you've been. I let a beat of hesitation pass, the kind a woman might show when finally letting go of something she'd been holding too tightly, and then I smiled. Monday, I said. Let's do Monday. I'll have the whole weekend to feel settled about it. Diane's face lit with something close to triumph. Jonathan reached over and squeezed my hand, and I let him, and I smiled back at him with an ease that would have terrified me a week earlier, because I understood now, watching his relieved, satisfied face, that I was no longer the woman standing in the way of his plan. I was the woman closing the trap around it. The days between Thursday and Monday passed strangely stretched thin by a tension only I seemed to feel. In the house, everything looked like happiness. Jonathan hummed while he made coffee in the mornings. Diane arrived nearly every afternoon now, tape measure in hand, murmuring about where a sectional might go once we open up this space a little, as though the walls themselves already belonged to a future she'd already decided on. I let them talk. I let them plan. I poured coffee and nodded at fabric swatches and asked polite questions about square footage, and underneath all of it I kept my phone recording in my cardigan pocket, kept my eyes open, kept building the case that Michael Grant would later call, with quiet professional understatement, one of the more thorough evidentiary files I've seen from a client who wasn't a lawyer herself. On Friday evening, Jonathan started talking about renovations with an openness he'd never shown before we married. He wanted to knock down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room. He wanted a home office in the basement, maybe a wet bar for entertaining his college friends, the ones who still called him by the nickname he'd had at 22. He talked about all of it with the loose, easy confidence of a man discussing a house he no longer thought of as jointly owned, but simply his, with me as a pleasant cooperative presence somewhere in the background of his plans. "We could even look at getting a place upstate eventually," he said, refilling his wine glass. "Once things are more flexible financially." "Flexible how?" I asked, keeping my voice light, curious, the voice of a woman who still believed she was simply along for the ride. "Oh, you know, once the paperwork's finalized, there's more room to make moves. Refinance again down the line, maybe pull some equity for investments. Nothing to worry about." He smiled at me over his glass, and I smiled back, and I thought about Thomas Reed's camera behind the bookshelf, still capturing everything, still quietly telling the truth even when no one in the room wanted it heard. Saturday brought Diane in full force, moving through my kitchen with a confidence that had stopped bothering to disguise itself as guest-like politeness. She opened the pantry and rearranged 2 shelves for better flow. She stood in the center of the living room, hands on her hips, and told Jonathan that the fireplace mantle would need to be replaced. Something with real character, not this builder-grade nonsense, the way you'd speak about a house you already owned outright. Not one still legally standing in another woman's name. It was Sunday evening, the night before the scheduled signing, that gave me the piece of evidence I hadn't even known I was still missing. Jonathan found me in the kitchen, washing the last of the dinner dishes, and he came up behind me, wrapping his arms around my waist in a gesture so familiar, so achingly ordinary, that for one unguarded moment, I nearly forgot everything I knew about him. He kissed the side of my head and murmured low and warm, thinking he was speaking only to me, thinking he was speaking to a woman who trusted him completely. Once everything's transferred, he said, "You won't even have to think about any of this again. You'll just wake up one day and it'll all be handled. You won't even realize how it happened. That's the whole point. I want to protect you from having to deal with all this stress." I kept my hands moving in the soapy water, kept my breathing even, and somewhere in my cardigan pocket the small recorder captured every word. "That sounds nice," I said, and I meant it to sound soft, grateful, the voice of a woman being cared for. Only I knew what those words actually were, a full, unguarded confession spoken by a man so certain of his victory that he no longer felt any need for caution. Monday morning I met Michael Grant one final time before work in the parking lot of a coffee shop, 3 towns away from anywhere either of us was known. He confirmed that every filing was complete. The notice of interest recorded, the deed protections in place, the documentation package assembled and ready to be presented the moment it was needed. He looked at me with the same quiet respect he'd shown since our first meeting. "Are you ready for this evening?" he asked. "I've been ready," I said, "since the day I watched that video." That evening, I came home and found Jonathan setting the dining table with unusual care, the good plates, the candles we'd received as a wedding gift, and never once used a bottle of wine he'd clearly chosen for the occasion. Diane arrived shortly after, dressed as though for a small celebration, her smile wide and satisfied. A little dinner before the signing. Jonathan said, pulling out my chair for me, "We thought you deserved something nice given everything you've been so understanding about." I sat down at the table. My father's money had helped build across from the 2 people who had spent weeks quietly planning to take it from me. And I smiled, and I picked up my glass when Jonathan raised his in a toast. "To new beginnings," he said, his eyes warm, his voice full of a happiness I once would have given anything to earn. "To new beginnings," I echoed, and I meant something entirely different by it than he did. Diane smiled at us both, radiant, already decorating a house that would never truly be hers, and neither of them noticed the way I kept glancing toward the front door, waiting, counting the minutes, knowing that somewhere on the road toward our house, a car was already on its way, carrying a man who would arrive before dinner ended and change everything they thought they had already won. Dinner unfolded exactly the way Jonathan had planned it. Candlelight flickering against the good China wine poured a little too generously. Diane telling a long story about Jonathan's childhood that was meant, I think, to remind me of how deeply he belonged to this family, how naturally I should want to belong to it too. I laughed in the right places. I asked the right questions. I ate very little because my stomach had been tight with anticipation since that morning. But no one seemed to notice, too absorbed in their own quiet celebration to look closely at me. When the plates were cleared, Jonathan reached into the sideboard drawer and pulled out the folder, setting it on the table between us, with a gentleness that almost looked like reverence. He opened it to the final page, smoothing it flat with his palm, and slid a pen across the tablecloth toward me. "No rush," he said, though his eyes said otherwise. "Whenever you're ready." Diane leaned forward slightly, her wine glass forgotten in her hand, watching the pen the way a person watches the last few seconds before a firework goes off. I picked it up. I let my fingers rest against it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, feeling the weight of everything the last 2 weeks had asked of me. The silence I'd had to keep, the smiles I'd had to fake, the nights I'd spent awake with a phone recorder in my pocket and a heart full of grief for the marriage I'd thought I had. I lowered the pen toward the signature line. The doorbell rang. Jonathan's head snapped up, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. "We're not expecting anyone," he said more to himself than to me, and he glanced at his mother, who shook her head slightly, equally confused. "I'll get it," I said, and I set the pen down without signing a single letter. I opened the door to find Michael Grant standing on the porch in a gray suit, calm and unhurried, a leather folder tucked under his arm. Behind him, a step back, stood a uniformed court officer holding a small stack of documents. "Good evening, Mrs. Baker," Michael said, his voice pitched perfectly for the moment, professional, unbothered, utterly without drama, which somehow made it land harder than if he'd shouted. "I believe this is a good time." I stepped aside and let them in. Jonathan rose from the table so fast his chair scraped hard against the floor. "What is this?" His eyes moved from Michael to the officer to me, and I watched something behind them begin to shift. The first tremor of a man realizing the ground beneath him was no longer solid. "Catherine, what's going on?" I didn't answer right away. I walked back to my seat at the head of the table and sat down, folding my hands in front of me the way I had learned to do in Michael's office, calm, deliberate, a woman fully in possession of herself. "Mr. and Mrs. Baker," Michael said, addressing Jonathan and Diane both, "I'm here on behalf of my client Catherine Baker to formally notify you that the property at this address has been legally protected against unauthorized transfer, refinancing, or encumbrance. Any documents requiring her signature for such purposes are void as of today, and any future attempt to alter ownership status will require independent legal review and her verified, unpressured consent." The court officer stepped forward and placed the documents on the table beside the folder Jonathan had so carefully prepared, an almost absurd symmetry, one stack representing the future they'd planned, the other quietly dismantling it. Diane's face had gone pale, her earlier warmth entirely drained away, replaced by something colder, sharper, the calculation she usually kept so carefully hidden now fully visible. "This is absurd," she said. "This is our family's home. Jonathan has every right. Jonathan has whatever rights are granted to him under the law and under any agreement Catherine willingly and knowingly enters into," Michael said evenly. "Neither applies here." Then he reached into his leather folder and set down one by one the evidence I had spent 2 weeks gathering in silence. Printed transcripts of the security footage from Thomas Reed's camera. Screenshots of the refinance documents, page 14, circled in red. Copies of emails between Diane and the mortgage broker she'd contacted without my knowledge. And finally, a small device, the voice recorder, which Michael pressed play on, filling the dining room with the sound of Jonathan's own voice from the night before, warm and unguarded, saying words he never imagined would be replayed in front of a court officer at his own dinner table. "Once everything's transferred, you won't even have to think about any of this again. You won't even realize how it happened." Jonathan's face drained of color. Diane sat frozen, staring at the recorder as though it were something that had betrayed her personally. "How long have you known?" Jonathan asked, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier confidence, almost pleading. I looked at him, really looked the way I hadn't allowed myself to since that first phone call, searching one last time for some trace of the man I had married, the one who held my hand at my father's funeral, the one I had trusted with everything I had left in the world. "Long enough," I said. The words hung in the room, simple and final, and I watched something in Jonathan's expression finally break. Not surprise, not even anger, yet just the slow sinking understanding of a man who had spent weeks so certain of his own success that he never once considered the woman across the table might be watching him just as carefully as he'd been watching her. Diane opened her mouth to speak, then closed it again, her eyes moving over the documents on the table with the desperate calculation of someone searching for an exit that no longer existed. The candles were still burning. The wine was still half full in our glasses. And somewhere beneath the ruins of the celebration Jonathan had planned so carefully, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel yet, not triumph exactly, but a quiet, settling certainty that whatever came next I would face it standing on ground that was finally and undeniably my own. For a long moment, no one at the table moved. The candles burned lower wax, pooling unevenly against the good china we'd never used before that night, and the silence stretched until Jonathan finally found his voice again, though it came out smaller than I'd ever heard it. "Catherine, this isn't what it looks like. I never meant to take anything from you. I was trying to make things easier for both of us. You've always hated dealing with paperwork with all the financial stuff. I was just trying to handle it so you wouldn't have to." "You were trying to handle it," I repeated quietly, so completely that I would have needed your permission to make decisions about my own house. He had no answer for that. Diane, however, straightened in her chair, composing herself with the same brittle dignity she'd worn at every family gathering I'd ever attended. "This is a misunderstanding born of overcaution," she said, addressing Michael Grant directly as though she might still negotiate her way out of a room that had already closed around her. "We were simply trying to streamline the family's financial planning. There's no crime in wanting things structured efficiently." Michael didn't raise his voice. He rarely needed to. "Mrs. Baker," he said, using my name deliberately, letting it settle in the room as a correction to whatever version of ownership Diane still imagined for herself. "Efficient financial planning doesn't require concealing intent from the person whose signature you need, nor does it require characterizing that person's trust as something to, in your son's words, use correctly. I have that on recording as well. Should you'd like me to play it again?" Diane's mouth pressed into a thin line. She said nothing further. The court officer stepped forward with quiet procedural calm and confirmed what Michael had already explained, that the property remained solely mine, that any financial authority Jonathan may have believed he was gaining through the refinance paperwork had been formally revoked and blocked before it could ever take effect, and that further legal action, should I choose to pursue it, remained entirely available to me. Jonathan's face throughout all of this moved through something like grief, though I found I couldn't fully trust that either, not anymore. Perhaps it was simply the grief of losing what he'd planned. I didn't know, and for the first time in 12 years I realized I didn't need to know. It wasn't my responsibility to understand him anymore. They left within the hour. Jonathan packed 2 suitcases in near silence, moving through the bedroom we'd shared for barely 2 weeks, with the stiff, careful motions of a man trying to preserve some final shred of composure. Diane waited by the front door, arms crossed, refusing to look at me. Though just before she stepped outside, she turned and said in a voice stripped of all its earlier warmth, "You'll regret this. Family is family, Catherine. You'll learn that the hard way, alone in this house." "I already have a family," I said. "The one my father built for me. And this house is part of what he left me, not something I'm willing to hand over to protect people who were never protecting me back." She didn't respond. The door closed behind them both, and the sound of it, quiet, final, ordinary, was somehow louder than anything that had happened all evening. I stood alone in the front hallway for a long time after they'd gone, listening to the house settle around me, the way it had on that first strange night, with Thomas Reed's USB drive sitting heavy in my coat pocket. I walked slowly through each room the way you might walk through a house you were seeing for the first time, though nothing about it had physically changed. The same hardwood floors my father would have run his hand along, admiring the craftsmanship. The same kitchen window that caught the morning light exactly the way I'd imagined when I first saw the listing photos. The same living room where a small hidden camera behind a bookshelf had quietly, faithfully told the truth when no one else would. It didn't feel like the house had changed. It felt like I finally understood what had been true about it all along, that it was mine fully and completely, in a way it had never quite felt before that phone call, before that video. Before I learned exactly what I was capable of when everything I loved was threatened. I called Thomas Reed the next morning, mostly to thank him again, though I think what I really wanted was simply to hear a kind voice after everything. He was quiet for a moment when I told him how it had ended, and then he said something I've carried with me since. "Houses hold on to the truth longer than people do, Mrs. Baker. I'm just glad this one still had a little truth left to give you. I think about that often now, in the months since, how close I came to signing away everything my father worked his whole life to give me, simply because I trusted the wrong smile at the wrong table. I think about how love, real love, doesn't need to be protected through secrecy, through paperwork slipped quietly past someone who trusts you too much to read the fine print. I think about how the truest kind of partnership is built in the open, not behind a mother-in-law's carefully arranged furniture catalogs or a husband's practiced reassurances. I still live in that house. I've since put in the tomato garden I always planned, and some mornings I sit on the porch with my coffee and watch the light move across the yard, and I think about how easily I could have lost all of it. Not just the walls and the windows, but the quiet, hard-won peace of finally trusting my own eyes over anyone else's words. If you were in my position, I wonder what you would have done differently or the same. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, and to know where in the world you're watching from tonight. We have so many more stories like this one to share with you, so please subscribe so you never miss a moment like this. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Let's keep walking this road together.